Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Kira Luna. At the time that we were doing this evaluation project, I was a prevention education specialist at the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico. And by virtue of that, I like to move around and all of that, but we can't today because we have the privilege of being filmed, so we will be at the podium. Don't judge our presentation style because we're at the podium, though.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Danielle Reed, and I am the Sexual Violence Prevention Evaluator with the New Mexico Department of Health.
So we're different heights, I'm realizing. So. We are so thrilled that you are here with us this morning. All of you must be data nerds just like us, because to sit through an hour and a half of evaluation may seem a little intense, but don't worry, we have activities for you today. So this session is really going to be like a timeline of this evaluation process that we went through to create a statewide evaluation programs for our primary prevention education programs in the state of New Mexico. So just so that you all know, and many of you are probably familiar with this, take care of yourselves during this session. If you need to leave for whatever reason, please do so. There is one evaluation question that we're going to share that may be triggering to some people. It deals with a rape myth, so I would just like to share that with you all now. To get a sense of who's in the room, how many of you are like myself and you are in the field working with communities doing some type of primary prevention education? Yay, welcome. And how many of you are more like Danielle, you're doing something maybe on a statewide level, Department of Health, a coalition, you're doing something with evaluation? Yay, we love you too. Thank you all for being here.
And are there any evaluators or epidemiologists in the room? Okay, great. Hi, I see you. Okay. All right, well then we'll go ahead and get started. Just as Kira mentioned, what we're going to talk about today is the process that we went through at the New Mexico Department of Health with our prevention partners to develop a comprehensive statewide evaluation that used common measurement tools, a common evaluation plan, so that we could get some data around the state of how folks were doing and be using the same tools to measure that. And so as a roadmap for today, we're going to talk about the background of sexual violence in New Mexico, the process we went through around developing plans and tools, what happened when we implemented the plan, what the data collection was like for the Rape Crisis Center and for the health department, lessons that we learned through the process that will hopefully help some of you, and our next steps. So just a little bit about New Mexico. How many of you have been to New Mexico? Great. Yeah, it's lovely. I welcome you to come again. So a little bit about New Mexico. It's a very large state geographically. It's actually the 5th largest state in the nation. That means that you could fit 3 of the state of Virginia in its borders or 12 of the state of Maryland. I would not recommend trying that, but you could. However, there is a relatively low population density. So it's 5th in the nation in terms of geographic size, but 36th in the nation in terms of population. What that means is that we have a lot of rural areas, and actually New Mexico has a lot of areas that are frontier status as well. So 79% of the counties in New Mexico are rural or mixed urban and rural. New Mexico is a majority minority state with 48% of the population identifying as Hispanic and 41% identifying as non-Hispanic white. And 9% of our population is American Indian. We have 22 federally recognized tribes. So some of the strengths that we have in New Mexico that's relative to this work is that we have a real respect for diversity and inclusion on a policy level. So we're the only state that has Spanish as an official language. We were also one of the first states to have gender identity and sexual orientation both included in our anti-discrimination laws. And that being said, we also have significant challenges. So New Mexico has a very high rate of poverty. It has a high rate of childhood poverty. And It's very difficult sometimes for prevention staff and health departments to get out into some of these rural areas. We have a pretty low high school graduation rate, and it's hard to do the work sometimes because of that. In terms of where we are in sexual violence, so the blue line represents New Mexico, rates of sexual violence as measured by the Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey. And the red line represents the United States. So the dotted line is a trend line. As you can see, the rate of forced sex among high school students in New Mexico has been going down pretty steadily from 2009 to 2015. I don't think that is statistically significant decrease from year to year, but it's moving in the right direction, much the same as it is in the United States. Our rate is a little bit higher than the US, but not significantly higher. So we're actually kind of right in the middle of all the states in terms of prevalence of forced sex among our young people. And the same for adults. About 1 in 5 women in New Mexico report a lifetime history of rape versus, about 18% of women in the United States. So that's where we are in doing this work. In terms of sexual violence prevention specifically, that map is the state of New Mexico, and the black stars represent where we have rape crisis centers. And so these areas are very, very different. So up in the top, your left-hand corner in San Juan County, that's in the Four Corners region where there's a lot of oil and gas industry. It's a politically conservative part of the state. And then all the way down to at the bottom in Doña Ana County, right below that is the US-Mexico border. So they have different challenges around being a border community and very different needs. In the middle is Bernalillo County, and that's where Kira did her work, which has a third of the population of New Mexico within that tiny little county. So that's where Albuquerque is, where the University of New Mexico is. It's the highest population density. And so there's a lot of very different needs, demographics, and political climates across the state, which makes it very challenging to try to do a statewide evaluation where you're measuring the same kinds of things. Another challenge is that some sites already had evaluations in place, and they thought that was just fine, thank you very much, and we're doing a good job, and we like it, so I guess if you make us, we'll do it, but who are you? And another challenge that we had was that there was a limited staff capacity in some areas. So some of the prevention sites would have maybe a half-time prevention educator or maybe a full-time prevention educator that really didn't have a lot of time for evaluation and also didn't have that kind of skill set around evaluation, mostly people that like to teach, people that like to be in front of people, not so much that like to sit and enter data. I don't get it, but that's what they said. That being said, there are a lot of strengths already when this process came into place. And what we found was that a lot of our sites were already addressing sexual violence from an anti-oppression perspective. And a lot of sites were already really dealing with what we consider to be the root causes of violence. Another strength was that we had funding for evaluation. So we had a full-time evaluator, that's me, just devoted to doing this project. Another strength is that before I came on board, we already had a precedent for having statewide quarterly primary prevention team meetings. So people from all of these sites would get together once every 3 months and be able to share information with each other, be able to get training together, make connections, get to know each other and bond. And that is a really big strength that we have in prevention. So the role of evaluation, this is the CDC model for evaluation. And the reason why we decided to do a statewide evaluation was, first of all, for accountability, not just to the health department and to our funders, but also to community members and really to the rape crisis centers themselves. Because we wanted to be able, from the very beginning, we wanted to be able to support folks in the work that they were doing and really give them information that would strengthen their programs, that would help them to get grants, that would demonstrate the impact that they were having. So it's really accountability. A lot of times in evaluation, you talk about accountability just to your funders, but we really see it as accountability to everyone in the state and in our communities in particular. That being said, we do have to be accountable for funding to our funders, and we wanted to be able to use these data to make program modifications to increase effectiveness where we weren't seeing very much effectiveness. So as Kira mentioned, we're going to share this on a timeline. And this process really began in May of 2014. And we're really just wrapping up now the first year of that evaluation. So that's more than 2 years. And that's a takeaway that I would really like you all to have from this session, is that this took a long time, and it took a lot of work, and it took a dedicated staff. So if in your state you're trying to do a similar thing and it's taking a while, just know that the process is going to take a while. I use the image of a person on a tightrope here because that's really how I felt about my role in a lot of this. I was hired by the health department to do this statewide evaluation, very explicitly saying you might need to explain to people why this is important to have a statewide evaluation. People might not really be on board. And so I felt like I was always walking that tightrope between wanting to respect the work that was being done in communities, wanting to give communities what they needed in terms of data, and also keeping my job and being accountable to the health department, knowing that this is something that we needed, but knowing that it was really going to take some finessing to be able to get, I don't really like to say get buy-in, but like really authentically build something that people were going to believe in and participate in. So in 2014, when I started, this image is just kind of randomness in my mind. That's really where evaluation was for a little while, most of what from the health department perspective. So most of what the health department was doing at the beginning of this process was really performance monitoring, reporting on how many people did you serve, how many sites did you go to, in some cases, what were the demographics of the group. There were some sites, as I mentioned, that were doing independent evaluations at that time, but we really didn't have any way to compare progress from site to site. So some folks were asking some questions about this, and some were asking questions about that, and we really couldn't say who was doing a good job compared to anyone else or any kind of common metrics. And Kira's going to talk a little bit about, from her perspective, what was happening at the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico when this process began.
So as Danielle mentioned, there were some of the rape crisis centers in New Mexico that were doing independent evaluations, and the Rape Crisis Center of Central New Mexico was one of those. So our curricula were based on research, but our evaluations were kind of like, hey, let's do this question, let's do that question, let's put smiley faces and sad faces to make it more accessible. And so when we started this whole entire statewide process, we had these three things going for us. And I would say that compared to some of the other rape crisis centers in the states, what we were doing in terms of evaluation more closely mirrored what we ended up doing as a state. So for us, this entire process maybe wasn't as hard to come into, but it was still very new for us, education folks. So how many of you all at this point in time, for the educators in the room, do a pre and post test? Show of hands. So you're pretty familiar. As Danielle mentioned, our state does recognize Spanish and English as both official languages, and so our evaluations were also in Spanish and English. Then we also did a site coordinator survey. It was a 7-question survey. It was kind of like a climate assessment. We would give it to either the teacher or the social worker because our programs mostly are in schools, and that's mostly who we would work with. So we would give it to them beforehand and ask questions such as, do you see sexual harassment in the hallways at your school? Do your students talk about these types of things to each other? And then we would also administered that same survey, same 7 questions after the program. I will say, admittedly, though, that sometimes it varied. So sometimes on the last day we would give them that survey. Sometimes we'd maybe email it like a month later. And then we did something called advisory gathering. So we had a youth advisory committee and an adult advisory committee, and these were really a strength of our evaluation program. From our perspective. So with the youth advisory gathering, it would be a group of youth who had actually gone through our program. And we intentionally would go back to the site, typically, as I mentioned, to school, a couple months after they had completed the program. So we wanted to see what did they retain, what knowledge did they actually hold on to. And it would be several hours. We would do a lot of different activities to help understand what information they gained, to understand what they were going through as young people walking through this world. And then we would take that and we would integrate it into our curricula. We'd make modifications based on what we learned. Then we also did a similar process with adults. So these were all adults who were working with youth in some way, shape, or form in their community. Of course, we always were looking for diverse representation in all sense of the word diversity. And we would do the same thing. We would sort of share our curricula with them. They would offer feedback about it, which we would then integrate. But in the adult version, we did two really important things. We also did a lot of networking, and we said, who are we not reaching in our community? So as Danielle pointed out, in the central New Mexico area where I was working, we had about 1/3 of the state's population. And we had 2 prevention staff that were actually in the field working with youth. And so we really needed to rely on our colleagues to find out who are we not reaching, who can you connect us to, what schools can we get into that we're not already. And then lastly, the advisory gatherings, they would share best practices. So, hey, I work with youth and they're really into this song right now, so maybe you can integrate that into your curricula somehow. So for us, these were incredibly helpful. And so from there, this is like where we were at as a state, and now we're going to launch into the transformation, into this entire process of how we started to work together collaboratively to create the statewide evaluation plan.
So the first thing that I needed to do as a health department evaluator was really do my homework and research what were the risk factors and the indicators and measures for sexual violence. As you all know, sexual violence perpetration and victimization are things that change very slowly over time. So we knew that what we want is a reduction in sexual violence, but we also knew that that wouldn't be a good indicator to measure our progress by, because it was going to take a really long time to change. And so I needed to find out what were the more immediate indicators that represented the risk factors for sexual violence perpetration in particular. And then use that information to develop a statewide logic model and really map out what we were going to do as a whole state, look at what each individual site was doing, and then put that all together to be able to visually see where we were going as a state. And so this is our logic model that represents the primary prevention school-based programming that we do. We also have moved into doing some other communications and policy work, but this is just the programming part. And so, we mapped it out with activities and outputs, and then the short-term outcomes, the long-term outcomes, and the impact, and tried to determine which of the short-term outcomes we could measure in the pre-test, post-test, and follow-up tests that Kira was talking about. So through a review of the literature, we identified several outcomes that we wanted to measure that were most closely related to sexual violence perpetration. And those were rape myth acceptance, adherence to rigid gender norms, acceptance of couple violence, and bystander intent and behavior. It seemed like this is what pretty smart people were doing across the country, so this is what we would measure also. And then before I started working as an evaluator, I was a community engagement specialist, and I've always really done a lot of work in communities, and I really value community input. And so as an evaluator, I place a lot of weight on qualitative data, and it's very important to me to get the story behind the story, to really be able to fill in what the numbers don't tell. So I wanted our evaluation plan to also include quite a bit of rich qualitative data. From there, once we had identified the indicators, it was time to identify validated measures. And I found a few. They were all really long. And most of them were developed for college audiences. I think the Gender Equitable Men's Scale was developed not in the United States. They were not, to make a long story short, they were not accessible to our middle and high school students in New Mexico, many of who, we have pretty low literacy in New Mexico, as I mentioned earlier. So there was no way that our partners at the Rape Crisis Centers were going to administer a 100-question survey to students during their programs, right? I didn't even bother to ask. And even if they could, the students were not really going to be able to understand the questions. So now what do? These are the things that we want to measure. these are the things that we have available to us. Oh, and now we're going to do an activity.
Okay, so this activity mirrors a process that we actually did.
All right, thank you all. So those are really similar to the ones that our prevention partners actually did choose. So what we did as a part of this process was sent each of those scales to all of our prevention partners across the state and asked them to go through the process that you just went through, without the modifications for now, but we did recognize that we were going to have to modify the questions a little bit. So we sent all 4 scales to everyone. We asked them to vote on which ones they felt were most reflective or salient to their community. Then I tallied the results, and every organization got a vote and counted them up and created the measure with the ones that came to the top. I had no idea how that was going to work. I didn't know if everyone was going to pick something different, but somehow the ones that, there were clear ones that rose to the top, and so that was a huge relief for me. And we created the measure.
So as you can see, Danielle and the Department of Health did an amazing job of making this a really inclusive process. So right from the start, the folks who had previously been doing evaluation, the primary prevention folks, weren't just told this is what you're going to use. We very much had a say in the tools as they were being implemented. So if you are able to and would like to participate in this, I'm going to have you cross your arms. So once your arms are crossed, I want you to look down and see which arm is in front. So for me, it's my right arm. So make note of that. Now I want you to uncross your arms, kind of wiggle, because I was in those seats and you all are really close together. Let it out. I want you to cross your arms again, but this time I want you to put the other hand in front. Yeah, right? How did that feel? Kind of awkward. You're like, So this is how we felt when the Department of Health, who had been our funders for many years, came to us and said, hey, that's great that you've been doing evaluation, and hey, it's great that you're doing so many different forms of evaluation, but now you're going to use this thing that everyone else is going to use. And we were like, but wait, our program's so unique and special. How can we possibly have the same evaluation? So that was our initial reaction. It felt a little uncomfortable, but then we realized, okay, it's a little different. It's still an evaluation, and it's going to be of immense value to know, hey, that our programs are working, because as I told you, we just kind of made up the questions ourselves to fit our curricula before. And so what we did, we all, as prevention staff, we all individually read through those questions, sort of like you did, except there were a lot more, and we came together and decided which ones we were going to submit, saying that we thought they should make it into the final measure. And then we talked. And we talked about what we were going to say when we had our upcoming prevention meeting. So Danielle mentioned earlier, one of the incredible strengths of primary prevention in New Mexico is that we would meet every couple of months. So all the different primary prevention staff across the state would come together. And we knew that there was going to be a meeting where we were going to discuss these different measures. And we were like, okay, we don't feel 100% like this is where we want it to be. And we wanted to make sure we had our points heard when we showed up at that meeting. So for us, the main things were that the language was really inaccessible, especially for our middle school program. We also, similar to a comment that was made, felt like the language was pretty heteronormative, and that it really needed some tweaks in terms of how gender was represented. And then we also just felt like, wow, this is going to be really hard for students to actually take and finish in the amount of time that we had allotted for evaluation in our one-week programs. So we had those points. We showed up at the meeting, which Danielle's going to talk more about, but I'll just say now that we were present. We were very surprised that other rape crisis centers had those same points, and we were pleasantly surprised that the Department of Health was willing to work with us to modify those questions. So all in all, it was a very happy meeting, but that was my side. Now you got to hear Danielle's.
So my arm crossing experience was like, I wanted to use validated measures, right? I wanted to do a research study with our state and really show that we were really making a difference using validated measures. I wanted that 100-item measure, and that was not going to happen at all. And so I recognize that the modifying the questions and taking them out of context and combining them in a tool no longer makes it a validated measure. I recognize that. I get it. But I had to remind myself, this is public health practice. It's not public health research. And that was my arm crossing. It's like, this is uncomfortable, but this is what the community wants, so that's what we're going to do. And so the next step in this process was to review and modify the measure at the primary prevention team meeting. And let me tell you, I was terrified to go to this meeting because I was certain that I was going to show up at this meeting with all the primary prevention people from across the state who I had grown to be quite fond of and respected a lot and really saw as my peers. And I was going to tell them, this is what we're going to have to do, and they were just going to give it to me. You know, they were going to like, we don't want to do it. This is a problem. This isn't going to work in our communities. Why, you know, you're the man, basically, and we don't want to listen to you. I really was very concerned about going to this meeting. And I showed up, and it was great. It was great. Everybody felt expressed that they felt really heard. They felt like we had created a safe space for them to show up and express their concerns, and I was going to listen to them, and we were going to work together. And we had a really successful gathering. We reviewed the items that people had selected and the proposed measure, and we talked about it. We talked about modifying the language and the concerns that we had with that. And then after that meeting, we revised some of the questions, and we sent it back out for feedback. And this was an iterative process that went on maybe over the course of a month, where we sent that out several times and took people's comments and considerations, you know. And some of the revisions included, readability, LGBTQ inclusion, things like that. And everybody agreed. Everybody came to consensus that we would use this measure, which is one of the happiest days of my life. And so then we had it translated into Spanish, and then we were like, let's do it. Let's put this in the field. And this is a pilot year for evaluation, so we were like, let's see what happens this year. So one of the ways that we modified a question, just as an example, is on the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. It says if a woman is raped while she is drunk, she's at least somewhat responsible for letting things get out of control. And we wanted to change that to if someone is raped, and also add while they're drunk or on drugs, to reflect the reality that our students are living in, unfortunately. So that was the measure, and as I mentioned before, I also put a high value on qualitative measurement. So there were a couple other components of the evaluation besides the survey instrument. We asked that all of the program facilitators complete an interview with me at the end of their program with each cohort, and talk about the successes and challenges of implementation, the successes and challenges of evaluation, anything unexpected that happened. This was very, very valuable to me because I was still relatively new, and I was able to really get a sense of what was happening on the ground and what people's programs really looked like. We also did a participant roundtable, or we asked the facilitators to do a participant roundtable at the end of the program, in which the students would get together and the facilitator would ask them questions like, what did you like about this program? Do you feel like the topics apply to things going on in your life? And the final component was a teacher interview, where we asked the teachers if they believe this was a positive program for their students, and if they had noticed any changes in sexual harassment. And so, all of those things, the survey, the roundtable, the teacher interview, and the program facilitator interview all went together to what we thought of as the evaluation packet. And this was starting to get really confusing for people. So like, wait, I have to do what? And then I have to do this, and does that count as that? And so I put together an evaluation guidance document that had everything in it. It had all the questions that needed to be asked. It had all of the survey instruments. It had expectations around when data would be submitted, timelines, just basically everyone that someone would need, so that they would have a document they could refer back to at the end of every program and make kind of a checklist and figure out what needed to go to me and when. So now we're at the stage of the instruments being in the field. And Kira's going to talk about some of the successes and challenges that they experienced around implementing the evaluation plan.
Okay, so just to review, this is what we were now working with in our statewide evaluation plan. We had the participant roundtables, the teacher interviews after the program, and then the check-in with the Department of Health evaluator, i.e. Danielle. And then we also did the pre-post and 1 month follow-up tests.
Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah. Oh, do you want me?
Sure.
Okay. About just the pre-post? Okay. So the pre-post, it was similar. We would administer it on the first day of the program. The post would be the last day of the program, keeping in mind that, for example, all of the programs I did tended to span like Monday through Friday 1 week, but some of my counterparts at other rape crisis centers had programs that would go over several weeks. So whatever the start of the program was, that's when the pre-evaluation was administered, and then the post on the last day. And then something that was new for us was this 1 month follow-up test. And so different rape crisis centers did this in different ways, but basically 1 month after a program finished, we would administer the post test once again, so we could see what information was retained during that time frame. Do you want to add anything? Okay. So what this looked like here at our rape crisis center was that Danielle put together this amazing document, which she referred to, that really laid out all of these 4 different pieces. But it was a big document, and when you're running from one school to the next, you don't have time to read through all that. So we actually took that and distilled it down into checklists. We made different templates. Danielle actually sent us templates to enter our evaluation data. So we had to figure all of that out in a pretty short time frame because school was about to start. We were going to start our programs. And then we needed to implement it. So the biggest thing that we needed to do before we could actually start implementing this is that we had to change our curricula. So this evaluation took a little bit more time than what we were doing previously, and so we needed to account for that. So we cut out some of the material on the first and last day. And then when we got to the schools, we realized that we didn't cut out enough. And so we had to modify as we went along during the school year. We needed to change things like instead of just handing out the evaluation, some of the different rape crisis folks started to read the evaluation out to students because some of the language, as we'll talk about, was still challenging, especially for our middle school students. One thing that I did is that we would go question by question when I was working, especially with 6th graders. Even though the evaluation was just 9 questions long, it was still really hard for people to focus for those 9 questions, and so we would take it one by one. So things like that. We also had to make changes in the sense that we added a program. So suddenly we had this new program that we were working with parents on, and we didn't have an evaluation that fit. And so going back to that idea of flexibility and building a strong relationship between the actual people in the field and the Department of Health, Danielle was very understanding, and she helped us to create an evaluation out of the different elements we were already working with that would then fit our new program. From the perspective of a rape crisis center, some of the successes were that we had this validated instrument. So for the people who are really technical in the room, we get, as Danielle said, that it wasn't actually validated as one instrument, but it was from validated measures. And as I said, we were not doing that practice as a rape crisis center. We were making up the questions to fit the content of our curricula. And so for us, this was really like putting on our big girl chonies, as we say in my family, and realizing that we needed to really be serious about the work that we were doing, right? That our communities deserve that seriousness in how we were evaluating our programs. And we were so glad that we had somebody trained in evaluation to do that for us. We also thought that it was great that, as I just said, modifying the instruments was a possibility. So we had input throughout the entire process, and it was modified to fit our specific programs. And we felt really great about the instruments that we were using in our programs. We were very thankful to have somebody help us with the data analysis that went on. So we still input the data, but we're not trained in data entry and data analysis. And so we were so glad to have somebody who actually is trained to do that for us. It was still cumbersome to enter all of the data because for us there was more than before, but knowing that there was somebody else who was going to do that and we could focus on our end-of-year reports was a huge help. And then the regular communication was really important. So as Danielle mentioned, and I just sort of want to go into a little bit deeper, at the end of each program, we would have a check-in So we would be like, hey, Dee, hey, Kira, like, how is your program? And she had a set of questions we'd go through, and for us it was really helpful because that was time to actually sit down and reflect on the program that we had just done. So sometimes we would be doing 7 different classes a day, Monday through Friday, and Friday comes, and then guess what? Monday you're in a new school, and you don't really think from program to program about what you can be doing to improve the education that you're giving to the youth. And so when we'd sit down and we reflect, that really helped us as primary prevention staff to think about, okay, maybe next week I'm going to do this differently. And so that was a huge help. And then also, we didn't have to wait until the end of the year to report out everything that we were doing and try and remember, what were those successes? What were the challenges? We had been doing that on an almost, sometimes weekly basis with Danielle. In terms of the challenges, I sort of alluded to this, but it was a big time management thing for our rape crisis center. So suddenly we had to spend time not only doing a post-evaluation on the last day, but we also had the round table, which took a lot of time. And our center really struggled with that. And then we learned after we started to talk with others that people were dedicating a lot more time to the round tables and they were getting better results. And we'll sort of share more about overall findings towards the end. We still felt like the evaluation wasn't entirely appropriate for students, especially our 6th graders, so there were some language issues that came up, specific vocabulary that the students didn't know, which then made it really hard for them to answer the questions. One example of that is that they didn't know what LGBTQ stood for. I mean, it was spelled out, but they didn't know all of those identity markers, and so then it was like they couldn't answer the question until we explained that. And so we learned this as we went along. And then there was a gap between how we thought it was going to go and then how it really went when we stepped into the classroom. So we were like, we've been doing these youth advisory gatherings. The youth are really open. They share really great feedback about the programs. But suddenly when it was in that roundtable format in the last 10 minutes of class, and it's like Friday afternoon in some cases, they weren't so talkative. And we didn't necessarily have the budget to give them candy, so it was a little difficult. But as I said, that wasn't the case for everybody. And so having that check-in helped all of these challenges to become something that we could work with and improve upon throughout the year.
Back to being flexible, what I learned was that there was a significant variation in different staff's capacity for evaluation. And so some folks were able to complete the things and enter the data and get them to me in a timely manner, and some Rape Crisis Center staff just were not. There was also a variation in individual schools' willingness to complete the instruments, and so that took a little bit of back and forth and a little bit of massaging. From my perspective, the successes were that we ended up with consistent survey data from more than 3,000 student participants across the state of New Mexico, across 11 programs that had all answered the same questions, measuring the same constructs, which I felt like was a huge win. We also ended up with a very rich set of qualitative data from several different kinds of people, several different stakeholders, kinds of stakeholders. The site coordinator interviews were a huge success. I'm actually recording a podcast later about what my favorite evaluation tool has been, and this one stands out head and shoulders above the rest because, as Kira said, we were able to really troubleshoot a lot of different things that were happening in the programs in real time. And so because I was talking to different coordinators from different sites across the state, I was able to share with them how they had overcome some challenges with other people who were having that same challenge. For example, with the evaluation instrument, Rape Crisis Center was having a really hard time allotting the amount of time it needed for the students to read it. And when I shared that with another coordinator during their interview, I said, do you have a problem with that? Like, is it taking a long time? And he said, no, we read it out loud. I was like, oh. So then I was able to share that back with the Rape Crisis Center. And things like that, little modifications like that throughout the year were just very successful. And also getting those success stories after every single cohort. And we just got so much interesting information. And then we were able to make changes to both the programming and the evaluation. Challenges were that it was time consuming, especially to do those interviews. I would get, I think one day, I was like, Kira, can we just do this later? I can't do all of these right now in a row. We were doing like interviews back to back to back on Friday afternoons. It took a while. We got it down to about 10 minutes, but in the beginning, the interviews were taking 20 minutes for each individual cohort, so that took a while. There were some lags in data submission, and so I got so much data in May of 2016. It was like, because I was trying to be flexible and saying, it's okay, just send it in, like when you get a chance, just send it in. And then we had to make funding decisions for the following fiscal year all of a sudden. And so it was a ton of data, especially the qualitative data, which I really wanted to be able to do justice to and read through and get everything that I needed. But like for the teacher interviews, I would end up with 6 or 7 teacher interviews and trying to find common themes through that. It was just a lot. Some sites weren't able to get follow-up data, and so we just had to deal with that and try to troubleshoot how we could do the 1-month post-test, which honestly I thought would be a lot more difficult for folks than it ended up being. I was surprised at the amount of 1-month follow-up data that we were able to get. So some of the lessons that we learned, the site coordinators' interviews were very valuable, as I mentioned. The participant roundtables were more difficult than I expected because I thought that the students would be more talkative about the program. As we did mention, as Kira mentioned earlier, what I found out at the end of the year when I was doing my whole statewide evaluation is that sites that allowed a lot of time for the participant roundtables, after a few minutes, the students really did start to warm up. But that was difficult for people who had to modify their programming to allow more time for that. So places that were doing it at the end had 5 minutes and kids were ready to go and the bell was ringing, they really didn't get very much data at all. In terms of the survey, we are struggling with the issue of potential errors in data entry because we do ask the sites to enter the data and then submit it to me, and they're not trained in data entry, and honestly, anyone can make a lot of mistakes in data entry. And so I'm not really sure yet how we're going to deal with that. We've talked about maybe doing a Scantron survey. We've talked about having someone else do the data entry, having 2 different people do the data entry, which would be twice as time consuming. I don't have an answer for that yet. We're still working that out. We needed to reverse score some of the items. So for whatever reason, the measure that we ended up with had had 3 items from each scale, and all of the ideal answers were all number 4. It was a Likert scale. They were all number 4. So a student could literally just go down and mark all of them, probably figure that out pretty quickly. It just go straight down. So we needed to reverse score a few of the items, and we needed to change the vocabulary a little bit. So when I was doing the site coordinator interviews and I would ask, were there any problems with the evaluation, some things came up over and over and over again. Like students don't understand tolerate. They don't understand the word tolerate. They don't know what this other thing means. They just, So we were able to go back and modify for this year some of the vocabulary. We needed to have clearer expectations for data submission that was tied to funding. As much as I really wanted to be flexible and understand where people were at, it was just way too much to get all that data at the end of the year. And so now we're going to ask to have it in chunks. So the fall programming will submit all their data in January of 2016. We'll use that to make our funding decisions. The second half will have to be in by June, I think. So as an example of some of the things that came out of the program coordinator interviews, this is one of the stories that someone shared, that the same day as the program, she saw 2 10th grade students walking into a classroom that was empty and they were arguing. And they asked the social worker to come in and mediate their argument so it didn't turn into a fight, which is something that they taught in their program. And then another person, a senior that was walking by, offered to be the mediator. And so those kinds of little vignettes, I just don't think we would have captured at an end-of-year report when we say, we have to talk to CDC, what are your success stories? And they're like, like in October something happened. I just don't think we would be able to capture that if we weren't checking in with people at the end of all the programs. And so that brought us to, as I mentioned, worst month of my life. May of 2016, we had like tons and tons and tons of data that needed to be analyzed, which I mostly was able to do and suggest program changes for the next year. And what were the outcomes? Every single site had a program that shows statistically significant improvements on the knowledge and attitudes from the assessment. So every single site had a program that was successful with statistically significant improvements. All of them were successful in at least one of them, and 10 out of 11 were successful in all of them, in changing attitudes around all of those constructs. In most cases, the changes were also sustained at 1 month follow-up, which I thought was huge. The programs that were rooted in anti-oppression model were the ones that were most effective. They were highly effective. And actually some of the canned programs were not. And so that was really important and interesting for us to learn in New Mexico, because public health in New Mexico very often works that way and says that we need to talk about racism, we need to talk about heterosexism, we need to talk about all those things as anti-violence work, and we really believe that's true. And I feel like these data really support that, because some of the more canned programs that don't necessarily deal with that explicitly were not as effective as the ones that are talking about oppression. Programs that took place every day over the course of 1 week were highly effective, and there was overwhelming teacher support for the programming. It was difficult to do the evaluation, or to do the program in general, during testing periods and during holiday break, and the data entry was a huge burden. So we need to figure that out. I would like to take that off of the prevention staff, but I'm not sure how we're going to do that yet. And that brought us to August right now, when we have completed most of the evaluation reports for all of the sites, and we're working on sharing those out, sharing those with the prevention providers, but also sharing them out to schools and community members, and sharing the results with young people and those most impacted by the program. And I haven't really figured out how we're going to do that yet in a way that's meaningful to those young people, but I do believe that it's important. And revising the measures. So we did make a few changes to the attitudes measure, and we do have copies of those if anybody's interested in seeing the measure that we came up with. This is version 2.0. As Kira mentioned earlier, we created alternate measures for different programs that were doing a little bit different work. We created a dating violence scale that was based on another dating violence scale that was validated for people that were doing work that was specific around intimate partner violence. We have some programs that, most of the programs that we have are reducing risk factors for perpetration, but we do support a few programs that are increasing protective factors for our most impacted communities. So students living with disabilities and students who identify as LGBTQ. And so those programs that are working on protective factors, we developed sense of identity and sense of community scales to measure that. And we developed an adult bystander scale for programs that were working with residence life staff or working with teachers or other adult community members to intervene as bystanders. And so we'll see more of an increase now that we have the student evaluation kind of under control and we know what that's going to look like. Now we can move more into evaluating some of the work that we do that's higher on the spectrum of prevention. And we probably have to do fewer coordinator interviews because it took forever. I'd really like to be able to do climate surveys in schools. Has anyone been able to do that? It seems really difficult, where we're asking students how often they see sexual harassment, whether they feel safe in school, whether they've been harassed. In the same way, we'd like to get perpetration data, but that is also going to be very difficult. So I feel like these are conversations that are being had on a national scale about how are we really going to measure perpetration? How are we going to measure environmental level changes that go beyond just knowledge and attitudes towards sexual violence? We're going to have YRS data available to us by county, but we don't have it by school. So the extent to which you can use that to evaluate an individual program this is nothing new. This is something that we all struggle with in terms of seeing if our programs are effective. And then working on evaluating policy. I'm so hungry. I love all of you, but I really want to go to lunch. So if you have any more questions, just email me. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.